The cold sound of my son's footsteps still lingers in the hallway. Still, I stand there, pretending not to notice the piles of bills he promised to handle. As his voice echoes in the kitchen, I catch the faint scent of the milk he'd left behind, untouched. While I wait, a bitter clarity settles. He's been draining me dry, watching as I struggle. That's when I know. This isn't about survival. It's about control. I won't starve anymore, not for him. The tables are turning and he's about to lose everything. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Margaret stood in the dim light of her kitchen, the refrigerator door hanging open as she stared at the nearly empty shelves. A carton of milk, a few wilted vegetables, and a jar of jelly were all that remained. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the half-empty carton of milk, debating whether it was worth finishing. She hadn't had a proper meal in days, just bits and pieces of what she could scrape together. Just enough to keep the hunger at bay. Her stomach growled, but the emptiness inside wasn't just from the lack of food. She closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, her eyes landing on the small stack of bills on the kitchen table. Another electric bill. A notice from the gas company. Rent. All overdue. Margaret had been cutting back on everything. Clothes, toiletries, even heat in the winter. But it wasn't enough. It never seemed to be. Her pension, once a source of comfort and security, was being drained with no explanation. A shadow crossed her thoughts. A creeping sense that something wasn't right. For months, she had been scraping by, thinking it was just the tightening grip of time and finances. But there was something off. Something about the way James had been acting lately. Her son, James. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. The frequent trips to the bank, his odd insistence on handling her finances when he knew she could manage her own bills, the way he'd been avoiding her calls whenever she asked for clarity. It had started with small things, a few hundred here and there. Now it was enough to make her heart race with anxiety. She walked into the living room, where the stack of papers lay on the worn couch. It was a mess of receipts, medical bills, and her pension statements. James had said he was helping her manage everything, that it was easier this way. Easier for him, she supposed. But the way he'd smiled when he said it, like it was all for her benefit, made her skin crawl now. She sat down at the table and pulled the latest statement toward her. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper, scanning the numbers with growing dread. The numbers didn't add up. There were large withdrawals, amounts she never authorized, disappearing without a trace. The balance was alarmingly low. She flipped through the past few months, each statement showing similar patterns. There were no explanations, no details on where the money had gone. Her stomach twisted, and she felt lightheaded, as though the floor beneath her was shifting. A voice in her head screamed, "It's him! It's James!" Her son, the one she had raised and trusted, had been stealing from her, draining the money she had worked her whole life for. The very money meant to carry her through her final years, to ensure she never had to beg or worry about food. With a shaking hand, she dialed his number, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello, Mom," James answered, his voice casual, as though everything were fine. "James," she said, her voice cracking. "I need you to explain something to me. What's going on with my pension?" There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment Margaret could hear the sound of papers shuffling, the silence thick with tension. "I'm taking care of it, Mom," James replied, his voice tight but confident. "You don't need to worry. I'm making sure you're okay." She could hear the edge in his tone. She'd heard it before, the way he brushed her concerns aside, making her feel foolish for asking. But this time, Margaret wasn't going to let it go. "James, I'm looking at my statements. I can see the withdrawals. Why is my pension almost gone?" Her voice was quieter now, a quiet panic creeping into her words. There was a strained silence. Then James let out a breath, as though he was choosing his words carefully. Mom, I'm doing this for your own good. You've never been good with money. You always worry about everything. I'm just looking after you, okay? You can trust me. You don't need to see all the details. Margaret's heart sank, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. She wasn't sure if it was the betrayal that hurt more, or the realization that her son, her own flesh and blood, was taking advantage of her. James, I need to know exactly what's going on, she whispered. But James had already hung up. Margaret sat in the quiet of her small living room, the weight of the truth settling heavily in her chest. She stared at the phone, her mind racing. He had lied to her, and now she was alone, once again, with no one but herself to fight this battle. She stood up slowly and went back to the table, her fingers shaking as she sifted through the papers again, desperate for something, anything, that could explain where her money had gone. She picked up the last statement and stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. There it was. A large transfer, $100. And then another. And another. Each withdrawal was clearly marked, and each had a date when James had been with her. He had been taking her money, little by little, with no intention of stopping. She gripped the paper tightly, fighting back tears. She felt cold, hollow, like someone had pulled the rug out from under her and left her to fall. She had nothing left, nothing but these empty walls and the mounting fear of what she'd just uncovered. And still, there was more, much more. Margaret dropped the papers on the table and closed her eyes. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. But then, she felt it. The first, painful spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: determination. Margaret sat across from Linda at their usual corner booth in the small cafe, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. It was a gesture of comfort, but the warmth of the cup did little to ease the cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. Linda's concerned eyes were fixed on her, waiting, but Margaret didn't know where to start. Linda, Margaret whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I don't know what to do. Linda reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Margaret's. You're not alone in this, Margaret. You need to confront him. If you don't, it's just going to keep eating at you. Margaret felt the familiar pang in her chest, a mix of guilt and helplessness. She'd always trusted James. He was her son. But now, everything was different. It was a betrayal she couldn't seem to process, one that made her feel like she was losing more than just her money. She was losing her sense of self. I don't know if I can do it, Margaret said, her voice shaking. I thought I could trust him. I thought he was looking out for me. Linda gave a soft sigh, her fingers squeezing Margaret's. I know, but you can't let him continue to control everything. It's your money, Margaret. You have the right to know what's happening with it. Margaret nodded, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She had to confront him. She couldn't keep living like this. But what if confronting him only made things worse? You need to track everything, Margaret. Go through your records, Linda continued, her voice firm. And then, if you're sure he's been taking it all, you have to face him. Don't let him manipulate you anymore. Margaret nodded again, feeling the weight of Linda's words settle into her bones. She hadn't done enough. She hadn't dug deep enough. She had let James convince her that everything was fine, that he was just helping her. But now, she could see it. She had to do it. For herself. After the conversation, Margaret spent the rest of the day combing through the records, her eyes scanning each page with frantic precision. The more she looked, the more it became clear. James had been siphoning off nearly all of her $8,000 pension. The withdrawals weren't just small amounts, like she had initially thought. They were enormous, each one enough to leave her without even the basics. There was a transaction for $2,000, then another for $3,500, followed by a series of smaller ones that added up to a total she couldn't even bear to process. He was taking it all. Every penny. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the figures. She could feel the blood draining from her face. It was almost too much to comprehend, but the evidence was undeniable. The money wasn't just gone, it was going directly to cover his own debts, leaving her with nothing but a series of empty promises. Margaret's hands shook as she picked up the phone, dialing James's number once again. This time, she wasn't going to let him brush her off. When he answered, his voice was casual, almost too casual, as though nothing had changed. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the anger rising, burning like a fire in her chest. She had spent years trying to protect him, to believe in him. But now? Now she was done with the lies. "I know what you've been doing, James," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You've been taking my pension money. Almost all of it. I can see the withdrawals, and I know you're using it to cover your debts. Why?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched until it felt like it might choke her. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, I'm just trying to help you," James said, his voice suddenly defensive. "You've always worried about money, always stressed. I'm just looking out for you. You don't need to worry about it. I've got it under control." Margaret's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm, her words sharp. "I never asked you to control anything. You've been stealing from me, James. You've been taking my money. Money I worked my whole life for. Why couldn't you just tell me the truth?" "Mom," James sighed, his tone dripping with condescension. "You've never been good with money. I'm just doing what's best for you. Don't you understand that? I'm saving you from yourself." It felt like a slap to her face. The audacity, the manipulation. He was twisting the truth, making it seem like he was the one being reasonable, the one making the hard choices. And she was the one who didn't understand. Margaret's voice cracked, but she forced herself to speak. "You're taking everything from me, James, and I don't know how you can look at yourself in the mirror." There was a long pause. Then James said, in a tone that made her blood run cold, "You don't know what it's like, Mom. You've never had to face what I'm facing. I'm just trying to make sure we both get by." Margaret's heart was breaking. She had raised him to be better than this, to be someone who took responsibility, who would look after her in her old age. But now, all she could feel was the weight of her own regret. Her son had become a stranger. She slammed the phone down, the sound echoing in the quiet of the room. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free, but they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of anger. Anger at herself for letting it go on this long, for trusting him, for thinking that someone who had taken so much from her would ever have her best interests at heart. Linda's voice echoed in her mind. "You have to face him." Margaret wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. She didn't have a choice anymore. She couldn't let this continue. She had to fight for herself, for the dignity she had left. But as she stared at the phone in her hand, a new fear crept in. What would happen when she did confront him? Would he lash out? Would he try to manipulate her even further? And most terrifying of all, would she lose him entirely? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain. The battle was far from over. The days after her confrontation with James were a blur. Margaret spent every waking hour staring at the figures on her pension statements, trying to make sense of it all. Her house felt quieter than usual, the oppressive silence only broken by the sound of her own breathing. She couldn't escape the fact that the walls she'd spent decades building, trust, security, love, were crumbling around her. James hadn't called again, and for that, Margaret was grateful. But as the days wore on, the weight of the situation grew heavier. She had to do something. She couldn't let him get away with this. Every penny he took was another piece of her dignity slipping through her fingers. Linda had been her lifeline, her voice of reason, but even Linda was starting to feel the strain. She came over one evening, her face drawn with worry. "Margaret," she said softly as they sat at the kitchen table, "he's not going to stop unless you make him." Margaret swallowed hard, her eyes flicking to the half-empty jar of jelly on the counter. I know, but how?" Linda exhaled slowly, leaning forward. "You need to get legal help. It's the only way to take control back." Margaret's pulse quickened at the thought of involving lawyers. She'd never imagined her life would come to this. But she knew Linda was right. There was no turning back. The betrayal was too deep. The fear of what might happen if she didn't act was suffocating. The next morning, Margaret gathered her courage and called around for legal advice. By the time the sun was setting, she was sitting in a small, cluttered office across from David Lee, a local lawyer with a reputation for handling tough cases. David was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully as Margaret told him everything, her voice trembling at times but never faltering. He didn't interrupt, just nodded, taking notes as she explained James's manipulation and the theft of her pension funds. Finally, he spoke. "You've got a case, but you need more than just your word. You need proof." He paused, looking at her with a sharp gaze. "I can help you, but you're going to have to be smart about it. Gather everything. Bank statements, records, any communication you've had with James, and keep it quiet. If he knows you're looking into him, it'll only make things worse." Margaret nodded, her stomach knotting as the weight of what she was about to do began to sink in. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice low but steady. For the next few weeks, Margaret did what she'd been avoiding. She became a silent investigator in her own life. She started keeping meticulous records of every transaction, every withdrawal James had made from her pension. She hid the papers in a safe place, reviewing them late at night when she couldn't sleep. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that James was spiraling deeper into debt. His withdrawals weren't just to support her. They were to cover his own reckless financial mistakes. The weight of his problems was now her burden, and the thought of how deep he'd sunk made her sick. But as Margaret gathered more evidence, James's behavior became increasingly erratic. The phone calls, once sparse, now came every other day. He'd ask how she was doing, acting as though nothing was wrong, his voice too casual, his questions probing. One afternoon, Margaret found a note on her door, a post-it, stuck clumsily with a piece of tape. It was James's handwriting. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I know what you're doing." Her heart skipped a beat, panic creeping up her spine. James knew. Somehow he knew she was investigating him, and that was all it took to send the air in the room into a suffocating chill. She took the note down, her fingers trembling, but her mind was already running 100 miles a minute. She couldn't let him intimidate her, not again. This time, she was in control. She called Linda, voice tight. "He knows, Linda. He's on to me." Linda's response was immediate, her voice low and urgent. "Stay calm. He's trying to scare you. It's what he does. But you have the evidence now. You've come this far. Don't back down." Margaret squeezed the phone tight, her hand shaking as she nodded, though Linda couldn't see her. Later that evening, when the shadows began to stretch across her living room, the doorbell rang. Margaret froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was him. She didn't have to open the door to know it. The cold, angry feeling in the pit of her stomach told her everything she needed to know. She opened the door slowly, but before she could speak, James pushed past her, storming into the house. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes sharp with fury. "I know what you're doing," he spat. "You think you can just steal my life away, don't you?" Margaret stepped back, the air thick with tension. "James," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is my life, my money. I trusted you." His face twisted with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something darker, more desperate. You don't get it. This is the only way I can fix things. I'm trying to help us both. You've got no idea what I've been through. He advanced on her, the force of his words almost physically pushing her back. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. This time, she wasn't going to back down. I don't care what you've been through, she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been before. You've taken everything from me, and it's over. James froze. For the first time, the smug confidence faltered in his eyes. Margaret could see it. The fear. He knew she wasn't going to let him control her anymore. But that fear was quickly replaced by something colder. His eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know what you're getting into, he said through gritted teeth. Margaret's pulse hammered in her ears, but she met his gaze steadily, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and something else. Determination. She had crossed the line now. There was no turning back. Margaret sat in David Lee's office, a small, dimly lit space filled with stacks of legal papers and old law books. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching into an eternity. She clutched a stack of documents in her lap, the evidence of James's betrayal, bank statements, withdrawal records, and her own handwritten notes, proof of everything he had stolen. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the upcoming battle pressing down on her. The air in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. David, with his sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, had already assured her that they had a strong case. But Margaret couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about everything she had lost: trust, security, and the illusion of family. David's voice broke the silence. We've got everything we need, but we have to act quickly. James will try to make this difficult, but we have the upper hand. You're not just defending your money, you're defending your dignity. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She knew David was right. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was a fight for control of her life, a fight to reclaim what was hers. The moment Margaret filed the claim, it felt like the air shifted. The tension in her chest, the heavy weight that had been building for weeks, began to dissipate just a little. She had taken the first step, and there was no turning back now. But James's response was immediate and furious. The letter arrived 2 days after Margaret filed the claim, a formal accusation of defamation, accompanied by threats of a countersuit. His words, written in cold, cutting tones, were meant to intimidate her. He accused her of ruining his life, of betraying him in the worst possible way. You've ruined everything, his letter said. You'll regret this, I swear. No one will believe your lies. I'll see you in court. Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she read the letter, the words echoing in her mind. But as she read through the fine print, she saw something else, a crack in his bravado. James was desperate. He was scared. The manipulations he had used to control her were unraveling, and he knew it. David Lee was quick to reassure her. This is what we expected. He's trying to scare you, but it's a sign he's on the defensive. He doesn't have the evidence to back up his accusations. Margaret felt a flicker of hope in her chest, though the fear still clung to her like a shadow. She was doing the right thing, but the weight of what lay ahead, of the confrontation, of the public nature of the battle, still hung heavily over her. The days turned into weeks, and the process was slower than she had anticipated. The legal system had its own rhythm, one that felt like it was dragging her through a fog of paperwork, meetings, and motions. But with each step forward, Margaret felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't being controlled. She was taking control, making the decisions that would shape her future. Linda remained by her side, offering emotional support during the darkest moments. She would sit with Margaret for hours, listening to her fears and doubts, reminding her that she deserved justice, that she was entitled to reclaim what had been taken from her. "It's not just about the money," Linda said one afternoon as they sat in Margaret's kitchen sipping tea. "It's about your life. You've worked hard for everything you've got. You have a right to be free of this." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. She knew Linda was right. This fight wasn't just about money. It was about taking back her power, about standing up for herself when no one else would. But James wasn't going to give up easily. He began showing up at her house, his visits becoming more frequent. At first, he was subtle, calling to ask about the case, pretending to be concerned. But his tone grew sharper with each conversation, the false empathy replaced by something more sinister. He tried to manipulate her, to make her feel guilty for what she was doing. He would say things like, "I'm your son, Mom. You're destroying me. Can't you just let it go?" Margaret felt the pressure, the guilt threatening to pull her back into his orbit. But she didn't waver. She had made her decision, and this time, nothing would change it. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing more documents, the phone rang. It was James. Her heart skipped a beat, but she picked up the phone anyway. "Mom, I'm begging you." His voice was tight with emotion, the facade of calm slipping. "You're making a huge mistake. If you don't drop this case, I'll lose everything. You'll be the one to blame." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. She could hear the desperation in his voice, but it wasn't enough to make her back down. "James, you've already taken everything from me. This isn't about you anymore. This is about me. I have a right to live my life without fear of what you'll do next." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then he hung up. Margaret sat there for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear. She had never heard him so vulnerable, so raw. But instead of feeling sympathy, she felt something else. Something stronger than the fear and anger she had carried for so long. She felt relief. The relief of knowing that she was no longer at his mercy. As the case progressed, Margaret could feel herself changing. She wasn't just fighting for money anymore. She was fighting for her right to live without fear, without manipulation. The more she moved forward, the more confident she became. Every small victory, every legal document filed, every piece of evidence secured was a step closer to taking back control of her life. But as the trial date loomed, Margaret knew that the hardest part was yet to come: the courtroom, the final confrontation. And no matter how much she prepared herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. The final act was upon her, and there was no turning back. The night was thick with tension as Margaret sat in her living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. She hadn't been able to sleep for days. Every time she closed her eyes, James's voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the guilt he was trying to force on her. His threats, his manipulations, they were relentless. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she knew before she even looked who it was: James. It had been weeks since their last conversation, but he hadn't given up. Each message he left on her voicemail was a plea, a demand wrapped in promises of regret and empty apologies. But there was always an edge to them now, a subtle twist, something dark beneath the surface. Margaret hesitated, then picked up the phone. She had to hear him out. It was the only way to know what he would do next. "Mom, it's James." His voice was strained, almost pleading. "I'm not asking you to drop the case. I'm begging you. If you don't, it's going to destroy everything we have. You think this is about money, but it's not. It's about me. Don't make me do this. You've always been there for me. Please, don't make me expose you for what you really are. You'll regret it, I swear." Margaret's chest tightened, the familiar pang of guilt trying to slip through the cracks in her resolve. Expose you for what you really are. The words burned in her mind like a brand, like an accusation. She stared at the phone in her hand, the sound of his voice still lingering in the room like a presence, almost suffocating her. He was trying to make her feel like the villain in this story, painting her as the unfit mother, the one who would destroy her own son for the sake of money. Her breath caught as the weight of his words pressed down on her. Would the court see it that way? Would they believe his lies? Would they think she was being cruel, taking his only means of survival, when all he'd ever wanted was to take care of her? But she knew. She knew the truth. Margaret wasn't the one who had betrayed him. He had betrayed her. He had taken from her, manipulated her, and used her love for him as a weapon. She was not the villain in this story. He was. The phone slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the table as Margaret stood up, her mind racing. Don't make me expose you. It was just another threat, another way to weaken her, to make her doubt herself. She couldn't let him win. Not this time. Not ever again. Margaret picked up her phone again, her fingers trembling as she dialed a new number. She needed advice. She needed someone who could help her make sense of what James was doing to her. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, warm but professional. Sarah Matthews. Sarah, it's Margaret, Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. I need help. James is trying to manipulate me. He's using guilt, threats. He's telling me that if I don't drop the case, he'll expose me in court. He's saying I'll look like a horrible mother. There was a pause, and then Sarah's voice, steady and reassuring, came through. He's trying to break you, Margaret. It's exactly what abusers do. They twist the truth, make you feel like the bad guy when you're the one being victimized. Margaret sank back into her chair, her shoulders slumped. Abusers. The word hit her like a punch in the stomach. She had never thought of James in that way. But now that Sarah said it, the pieces fell into place. All the gaslighting, all the manipulation, it all made sense. Don't let him get inside your head, Margaret. You've already done the hard part by taking the first step. Don't let him guilt trip you into stopping. He knows he's losing control. That's why he's getting desperate. Margaret nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. He's losing control. She repeated those words to herself like a mantra, as if the act of saying them could reinforce her own resolve. I know, she whispered. But I'm scared. What if they believe him? What if they say I'm just trying to get back at him? That's his play, Sarah said, firm and unwavering. He'll try to manipulate you into thinking you're wrong. He'll make you doubt yourself. But you have the evidence, Margaret. You have everything you need. The truth is on your side. The words settled over Margaret like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of peace, a sense of clarity amidst the storm of emotions. She wasn't alone in this. She wasn't powerless. Sarah continued, her voice softening. You need to keep gathering evidence. Every conversation, every document. Don't let him get away with it. And remember, you're not just doing this for you. You're doing this for every woman who's ever been manipulated, taken advantage of. You're doing this to take back your life. Margaret wiped her eyes, suddenly aware of the tears that had slipped down her cheeks. She hadn't realized how much they had been weighing on her. Every woman who's ever been manipulated. The weight of Sarah's words was heavy, but it wasn't a burden. It was a call to action. I'm going to keep fighting, Margaret said, her voice stronger now, more resolved. I won't let him do this anymore. I'm proud of you, Margaret, Sarah said gently. Just don't let him twist the story. The truth is yours. As she sat back down at the kitchen table, she pulled the pile of bank statements toward her, her fingers moving over the paper with a steady determination. No more. This time, she wasn't just defending her money. She was defending herself. But as she glanced at the clock, a chill ran down her spine. The trial was getting closer. The final confrontation was just around the corner, and Margaret had no idea what James would do next. The courtroom was quieter than Margaret had imagined. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of murmured conversations bouncing off the cold marble walls. She sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench at the far end of the room. The gavel had yet to fall, but she already felt the weight of this moment. The culmination of everything she had fought for. Her lawyer, David Lee, sat beside her, flipping through the stack of evidence they had painstakingly prepared. Margaret could feel the gravity of it all, as though every piece of paper, every witness, every moment had led her here to this single, pivotal moment. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and there he was. James. The man who had once been her son, now standing across the room, eyes cold, jaw set. He looked different, harder somehow. His suit was immaculate, his hair combed back neatly, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. He was trying to present himself as confident, as someone in control, but Margaret saw the cracks beneath the surface. The facade was slipping. James glanced at her, and for a fleeting second their eyes met. He quickly looked away, but not before Margaret saw the flicker of something. Fear, maybe. It was hard to tell. For years she had been the one to smooth things over, to hold everything together. Now, the roles had reversed. She wasn't the one who had to hide her emotions anymore. He was. The judge, a stern woman with short-cropped gray hair, called the court to order. Her voice was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the noise. "We will begin the hearing. Ms. Harris, you may present your case." David stood first, his movements deliberate and calm. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as he turned to face the judge, his demeanor professional but warm. He wasn't just her lawyer today, he was her ally, her advocate. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to feel a sense of safety. He was going to make sure James couldn't manipulate his way out of this. "Your Honor," David began, "we are here today to address a matter of financial abuse and manipulation. My client, Ms. Margaret Harris, has been the victim of her son's deceit. Over the past several months, he has taken almost every penny of her $8,000 pension, leaving her with nothing but the threat of starvation. We have gathered substantial evidence to prove that these withdrawals were unauthorized and were taken for his own personal use, not in the interest of his mother's well-being." David turned to Margaret, offering her a reassuring nod before presenting the first piece of evidence. "Bank statements." The room fell silent as the judge carefully examined the papers David handed over. "Your Honor," David continued, "these are just a few examples of the extensive withdrawals made by Mr. James Harris. As you can see, these funds were transferred to pay off his own debts, leaving my client with little to survive on." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the judge scrutinized the documents. The evidence was irrefutable. There it was, in black and white. Every penny James had taken from her, every lie he had told, was laid bare before the court. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing as David's words rang out in the room. His attempt to maintain his composure faltered as the judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Harris," the judge spoke, her voice calm but firm, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" James stood, trying to project an air of confidence, but there was an edge to his voice now, a desperation that had been absent before. Look, I was just trying to help my mother," he said, his words shaky but determined. "She's always been bad with money. I was managing her finances for her own good. All of these withdrawals were to help her. I never meant to hurt her." Margaret's stomach churned at his words. The same tired excuses, the same manipulation. It was as if he hadn't learned a thing, as if he thought he could get away with spinning the same story. David wasted no time in responding. And yet, Mr. Harris, the withdrawals made from your mother's account were for your own debts, not hers. We have witnesses who saw you take money from her without her consent. This isn't about helping her. It's about using her funds for your own financial troubles. James's expression hardened, his voice rising in frustration. That's not true. You don't understand. This is all for her. She just doesn't see it. She's my mother, and I'm trying to take care of her. But the judge didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. Margaret could feel the shift in the room, the weight of the truth settling over everything like a heavy curtain. James's defense was unraveling, piece by piece. David leaned forward, his tone even but cutting. The truth, Mr. Harris, is that you've been taking advantage of your mother's trust, and no matter how many emotional pleas you make, no matter how much you twist the truth, the facts remain clear. You have been stealing from her. Margaret watched James's face change. The arrogant confidence he had walked in with was slipping away, replaced by something far less certain: vulnerability, fear, and maybe even a flicker of guilt. But it was too late. The truth had already been exposed. The judge was watching him closely, her eyes sharp as she processed the information in front of her. Margaret felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: strength. She wasn't just the woman who had been manipulated and broken. She was the one with the power now. She was the one who had taken control. James took a step back, his fists clenching at his sides. The last of his bravado crumbled, and for the first time, Margaret saw him for what he truly was: nothing but a man backed into a corner, with no more lies to tell. The judge cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. I will consider all the evidence presented here today. We will reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling. The gavel fell, and Margaret's heart raced in her chest. The final judgment was coming. And as she stood up to leave the courtroom, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The fight wasn't over, but she had won the first battle. Tomorrow, she would finally get the justice she deserved. The courtroom was quieter than Margaret had imagined. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of murmured conversations bouncing off the cold marble walls. She sat in the front row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench at the far end of the room. The gavel had yet to fall, but she already felt the weight of this moment, the culmination of everything she had fought for. Her lawyer, David Lee, sat beside her, flipping through the stack of evidence they had painstakingly prepared. Margaret could feel the gravity of it all, as though every piece of paper, every witness, every moment had led her here, to this single, pivotal moment. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and there he was, James. The man who had once been her son, now standing across the room, eyes cold, jaw set. He looked different, harder somehow. His suit was immaculate, his hair combed back neatly, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. He was trying to present himself as confident, as someone in control, but Margaret saw the cracks beneath the surface. The facade was slipping. James glanced at her, and for a fleeting second their eyes met. He quickly looked away, but not before Margaret saw the flicker of something. Fear, maybe. It was hard to tell. For years she had been the one to smooth things over, to hold everything together. Now, the roles had reversed. She wasn't the one who had to hide her emotions anymore. He was. The judge, a stern woman with short-cropped gray hair, called the court to order. Her voice was sharp and authoritative, cutting through the noise. We will begin the hearing. Ms. Harris, you may present your case. David stood first, his movements deliberate and calm. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as he turned to face the judge, his demeanor professional but warm. He wasn't just her lawyer today, he was her ally, her advocate. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to feel a sense of safety. He was going to make sure James couldn't manipulate his way out of this. Your Honor, David began, we are here today to address a matter of financial abuse and manipulation. My client, Ms. Margaret Harris, has been the victim of her son's deceit. Over the past several months, he has taken almost every penny of her $8,000 pension, leaving her with nothing but the threat of starvation. We have gathered substantial evidence to prove that these withdrawals were unauthorized and were taken for his own personal use, not in the interest of his mother's well-being. David turned to Margaret, offering her a reassuring nod before presenting the first piece of evidence: bank statements. The room fell silent as the judge carefully examined the papers David handed over. Your Honor, David continued, these are just a few examples of the extensive withdrawals made by Mr. James Harris. As you can see, these funds were transferred to pay off his own debts, leaving my client with little to survive on. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the judge scrutinized the documents. The evidence was irrefutable. There it was, in black and white. Every penny James had taken from her, every lie he had told, was laid bare before the court. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing as David's words rang out in the room. His attempt to maintain his composure faltered as the judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Harris, the judge spoke, her voice calm but firm. Do you have anything to say in your defense? James stood, trying to project an air of confidence, but there was an edge to his voice now, a desperation that had been absent before. Look, I was just trying to help my mother, he said, his words shaky but determined. She's always been bad with money. I was managing her finances for her own good. All of these withdrawals were to help her. I never meant to hurt her. Margaret's stomach churned at his words. The same tired excuses, the same manipulation. It was as if he hadn't learned a thing, as if he thought he could get away with spinning the same story. David wasted no time in responding. And yet, Mr. Harris, the withdrawals made from your mother's account were for your own debts, not hers. We have witnesses who saw you take money from her without her consent. This isn't about helping her. It's about using her funds for your own financial troubles. James's expression hardened, his voice rising in frustration. That's not true. You don't understand. This is all for her. She just doesn't see it. She's my mother, and I'm trying to take care of her. But the judge didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. Margaret could feel the shift in the room, the weight of the truth settling over everything like a heavy curtain. James's defense was unraveling, piece by piece. David leaned forward, his tone even but cutting. The truth, Mr. Harris, is that you've been taking advantage of your mother's trust, and no matter how many emotional pleas you make, no matter how much you twist the truth, the facts remain clear. You have been stealing from her. Margaret watched James's face change. The arrogant confidence he had walked in with was slipping away, replaced by something far less certain: vulnerability, fear, and maybe even a flicker of guilt. But it was too late. The truth had already been exposed. The judge was watching him closely, her eyes sharp as she processed the information in front of her. Margaret felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: strength. She wasn't just the woman who had been manipulated and broken. She was the one with the power now. She was the one who had taken control. James took a step back, his fists clenching at his sides. The last of his bravado crumbled, and for the first time, Margaret saw him for what he truly was: nothing but a man backed into a corner, with no more lies to tell. The judge cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the tension. I will consider all the evidence presented here today. We will reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling. The gavel fell, and Margaret's heart raced in her chest. The final judgment was coming. And as she stood up to leave the courtroom, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The fight wasn't over, but she had won the first battle. Tomorrow, she would finally get the justice she deserved. The courtroom felt suffocating as Margaret sat, her hands clammy, her mind racing. The gavel had fallen, but the weight of the final ruling still hung in the air like a dark cloud. She couldn't seem to steady her breath, each inhale too sharp, too quick. It had all come down to this moment. Everything she had fought for, everything she had endured, was about to be determined by the judge's final decision. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the judge, who sat at the front of the room, her expression impassive. It had been a long, grueling day, and now, after all the arguments, all the evidence, the court was waiting for a decision. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the room itself was holding its breath. James sat a few feet away, his posture rigid, his face drawn tight. His eyes flicked nervously from the judge to the documents in front of him, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He had been quiet since the last hearing, his usual bravado replaced by a cold, calculated stillness. Margaret couldn't tell if he was pretending to be confident or if he was truly afraid. Either way, she knew the truth now. His world was crumbling around him. David Lee, her lawyer, sat next to her, calm as ever. He had been a constant source of strength throughout the case, steady and sure. He had never doubted the outcome, and that certainty had bolstered Margaret's resolve. Still, she couldn't shake the pit of uncertainty that clung to her stomach. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The judge finally broke the silence, her voice sharp, commanding attention. I have carefully reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. Ms. Mahai, Harris, you have shown a clear pattern of financial exploitation by your son, Mr. James Harris. The evidence is unequivocal. Margaret's pulse quickened, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel the weight of her body pressing into the chair, as if the room itself was drawing her in closer to the truth. James flinched, his lips pressed tightly together, but he remained silent. The judge continued, her tone unwavering. You have shown that Mr. Harris made multiple unauthorized withdrawals from your account for his own personal debts, leaving you in a state of financial hardship. His attempts to justify these actions as being in your best interest are unsupported by the facts. Margaret felt the heat of her anger rise, but it was tempered by something else, a deep sense of relief, of vindication. All the years of doubting herself, of questioning whether anyone would believe her, were finally paying off. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't the one in the wrong. The truth had been laid bare before the court. David stood, his movements measured and confident as he approached the judge with the final piece of evidence. Your Honor, he said, holding up a folder filled with more documents. These documents further demonstrate that Mr. Harris has been withdrawing money from Ms. Harris's pension for several months, without her consent. These funds were never used for her care. They were diverted to cover his own debts and personal expenses. The withdrawal patterns speak for themselves. The judge nodded as she flipped through the documents, her eyes scanning the pages. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, had led to this moment. Margaret's mind flashed back to all the nights she had spent poring over the records, all the times she had doubted herself, wondering if she could truly trust what she was seeing. But now it was all clear. All of it was true. James shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched as he glanced at the judge. You don't understand, he said, his voice trembling. I was just trying to help her. You don't get it. This is all for her. I've always taken care of her. She's the one who can't see that. The desperation in his voice made Margaret's stomach twist. His words, empty and hollow, were all he had left. The act was over. The judge raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. Mr. Harris, your actions were not about helping your mother. They were about using her financial vulnerability for your own benefit. This court has no tolerance for such behavior. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The words she had waited to hear for so long, the words that would finally put an end to all of this, were coming. She didn't dare look away. Her eyes locked on the judge as she took a moment to review the final pieces of evidence. Finally, the judge looked up. Her voice, when it came, was clear and decisive. In light of the overwhelming evidence, this court rules in favor of Ms. Margaret Harris. Mr. Harris is hereby ordered to repay all funds he has taken from his mother's pension, along with interest. Furthermore, the court finds Mr. Harris responsible for the emotional distress caused by his actions and recommends counseling for the defendant. Margaret's heart raced, her hands trembling as she gripped the arms of her chair. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding her breath until it was finally released, her entire body sagging with relief. The weight of it all, the fear, the doubt, the constant pressure, had been lifted in an instant. James sat frozen, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words but failing. His hands trembled, and for the first time, Margaret saw him as he truly was. A man who had pushed too far, a man who had run out of excuses. The judge's gavel struck the podium with a sharp crack, and Margaret could feel her legs go weak beneath her. The sound reverberated through the room, marking the finality of the decision. It was done. The fight was over. As she stood up to leave, a wave of emotion washed over her, overwhelming her in ways she hadn't expected. She had won. The court had seen the truth. And now, for the first time in years, she was free. But as Margaret turned to walk out of the courtroom, she glanced back at James. His eyes were wide, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the court's decision settling over him like a crushing blow. For a brief moment their gazes met again, just long enough for her to see the last vestiges of his control slipping away. And for the first time, Margaret didn't feel anything for him at all. She walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, her heart free. She had won the battle, and now she was finally ready to reclaim her life. The days following the trial passed in a surreal blur. Margaret couldn't remember much about the first week after the verdict, just a sense of numbness, like she was moving through her life on autopilot. The court's decision had given her everything she had hoped for, but now that the battle was over, there was a deep ache in her chest that she hadn't expected. James was required to repay the stolen funds, though Margaret knew that financial recovery would take time. The slow process of getting her pension back, along with the necessary paperwork and red tape, was almost as exhausting as the fight itself. It felt like another weight, another thing to manage, but this time she felt a little more in control. The first few days of managing her own finances were strange. For so long she had entrusted James with that responsibility. His presence, his control over her money, had been so ingrained in her life that now it felt foreign, like a part of her routine had been upended. Margaret spent hours poring over bank statements, making sure everything was correct, relearning how to handle her finances as she once had before. James had wormed his way into the process. There was satisfaction in it, though, a quiet, powerful satisfaction in knowing that she was the one in charge now. Her hands didn't shake when she signed her checks or made a call to her bank. It felt like a small victory each time, like she was taking back pieces of herself she had lost. But there was also a new kind of wariness in her heart. She wasn't sure how to deal with the emotional toll James had left behind. The betrayal, his betrayal, had been so consuming, so deep, that the scars were still fresh. The legal victory had been one thing, but the emotional damage, that would take longer to heal. One afternoon, Emma came to visit. Margaret had been sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing her finances when she heard the knock on the door. She stood up and greeted her daughter with a smile, but it was strained. Her daughter was the one person who hadn't been a part of the fight, and Margaret could see the toll this had taken on her. "Mom," Emma said quietly as they sat down, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "How are you doing?" "Really?" Margaret hesitated, glancing down at her hands, which were folded tightly in front of her. She'd expected Emma to ask this, and yet the question felt too big to answer. What was she feeling? Relief? Yes. A sense of freedom? Yes, absolutely. But underneath that was a layer of something else, a hollow ache. I'm getting there, Margaret said slowly, her voice tight. It's just a lot, you know? The legal part was hard, but it's the emotional part that I didn't expect. It's like I don't even know how to move forward with him anymore, or how to move forward without him. Emma's brow furrowed, a shadow crossing her face. I get it, Mom, but I've been thinking about it and I don't know. It's like I'm worried about the strain this has put on our family. James isn't just your son. He's my brother too. The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Of course Emma would be torn. She had been as much a victim of James's manipulation as Margaret, but as a daughter, there was still a bond, an unspoken loyalty. Margaret could see it in her eyes, the guilt, the hurt, the complicated mess of emotions Emma had been carrying, too. I know, sweetheart, Margaret said gently. She reached across the table and took Emma's hand. I'll be honest, I don't know what the future holds. I can't just pretend everything's fine, but I do know this. I can't keep letting him hurt me, or hurt us. That part is over. Emma squeezed her hand, nodding. I just don't want to lose him completely, she said softly. But I guess if he really cared, he wouldn't have done what he did to you. To us. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand back, the weight of her words settling into her heart. If he really cared. Margaret had spent so many years telling herself that it wasn't too late, that things could be repaired, that one day James would change. But the truth was clearer now. He had made his choices, and no amount of hope could rewrite what had happened. I've been thinking about that too, Margaret admitted. I spent so long thinking I could fix it. Fix him. But I can't. I've done all I can. And now, it's time to do something for me. Emma blinked, looking at her mom as though she was seeing her in a new light. What do you mean? Margaret smiled, a spark of something new lighting up in her eyes. I'm starting a project. Something small, something for me. It's time to take control of my own life, Emma. It's time to invest in myself. Emma looked surprised, but there was a glimmer of admiration in her gaze. A project? What kind of project? Margaret leaned back in her chair, a new determination in her voice. I've always been good with numbers. I'm going to start a small financial consulting business. I'll help other women who've been taken advantage of. Teach them how to take control of their own finances, like I've had to. Emma's expression softened, and she smiled. That sounds amazing. Mom? Margaret nodded, a feeling of peace washing over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she had a plan. A real one. Something that was hers. But just as she was about to say more, her phone rang, pulling her out of the moment. She glanced at the screen. It was James. Her stomach twisted. The temptation to answer, the old pull, the residual love was still there. But she knew better now. She couldn't fall back into the pattern. Not now. Not again. Margaret let the call go to voicemail. I'm done, Emma, she said softly, setting her phone down. I don't owe him anything anymore. Emma gave her a nod, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret finally felt like she was ready to move forward. But as she turned to the window, a new thought crept into her mind. James was persistent, and she couldn't be sure that he wouldn't find another way to reach out. Would he ever truly let go? For now, she was free. But the silence left her wondering if the past would ever fully release its grip. Margaret woke early the next morning, the soft light of the sun streaming through the curtains. It was the kind of day that felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. The weight of the past few months, the trial, The betrayal, the fear, seemed a little lighter today. She wasn't sure how much of it was the distance from it all, or the fact that she had finally taken back control. But today, something felt different. For the first time in a long while, she was looking ahead, not over her shoulder. She had spent the past few days in a daze, just trying to catch up. She'd paid off the few lingering bills that had piled up during the legal battle, ensuring her financial security would no longer be an afterthought. Her pension was starting to be returned, and with it, a renewed sense of agency. She was no longer drowning in uncertainty. She had the power to decide how she wanted to live. Margaret made her coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, her notebook in front of her. The numbers were no longer something to be feared. Instead, they felt like old friends. Her strength, her means of freedom. She'd been practicing frugality for years, but now, with a steady flow of income and a renewed sense of purpose, Margaret was ready to put that money to work. She wasn't just saving for survival anymore. She was saving to thrive. The quiet clicking of her pen filled the room as she began to sketch out her next steps. It wasn't just about the consulting business anymore. She was planning for something bigger, something that would leave a legacy. She was going to teach women how to take control of their finances, to break free from the cycle of dependence and manipulation. She'd been a victim once, but now she was going to be the one offering the tools for empowerment. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Linda. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice lighter than she had expected. "Morning." Linda's voice was warm. "I've been thinking, we should get together soon. I have an idea I think you'll love." "I'm all ears," Margaret replied, smiling at the thought of seeing her friend again. Linda had been by her side through this whole ordeal, offering not only emotional support but practical advice when Margaret needed it most. "Why don't we host a workshop? Teach a group of women about managing money, handling debt, and avoiding financial traps. I know you've been wanting to start that consultancy. Why not do a free workshop first, to get the word out?" Margaret's pulse quickened. The idea felt exciting. Real. "That's brilliant. I've been planning to do something like that, but the idea of starting small, just to see how it goes, feels right." "I thought it might," Linda said, her tone upbeat. "I can help with the logistics. Let's start with a community center. Get a group of women together who are ready to learn. We'll teach them what you know, and you can get some practice before you go full throttle." Margaret leaned back in her chair, considering. The idea of helping women who had faced the same struggles she had seemed almost too good to be true. She could give them the tools to avoid the traps she'd fallen into. It was the next step in reclaiming her life, in turning the pain of the past into something meaningful. "I love it," Margaret said finally, her voice firm. "Let's do it." As they discussed the details, Margaret felt a sense of purpose growing inside her. She wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was building something new, something that would last. The thought of empowering others, especially women who had been taken advantage of, sparked a fire within her that she hadn't felt in years. After hanging up with Linda, Margaret spent the rest of the day drafting the outline for the workshop. She thought about the women she could help, the connections she could foster. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was used to that. Every step she took in this direction was a reclaiming of her power, her purpose. Later that week, Margaret met with Emma. The two of them hadn't had much time to talk recently, and Margaret wanted to share the new direction she was taking. Emma had been a rock for her, and it was important that she knew just how far Margaret had come. "I've got something exciting to share," Margaret said as they sat down in the cozy living room. She could see the curiosity in Emma's eyes. "Tell me," Emma said, her tone light but expectant. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling. "I'm going to start a financial consulting business, but first, I want to offer a workshop for women. Teach them what I've learned, help them take control of their own finances, like I'm doing now. Emma's face lit up with pride. That's amazing, Mom. You're really turning everything around. Margaret nodded. I think it's the only way forward. I can't undo what happened, but I can help others avoid falling into the same traps. And if it works out, maybe I'll make it a full-time thing. Emma reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. You've got this, Mom. I'm proud of you. I can't wait to see you succeed. Margaret smiled, feeling the strength of her daughter's support wrap around her like a warm blanket. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. Over the next few weeks, Margaret threw herself into the preparations. The first workshop was a success. Women showed up, eager to learn. They shared their own stories of financial abuse, of being taken advantage of by spouses, family members, and even strangers. Margaret spoke with confidence, guiding them through practical tools to regain control of their finances. The more she spoke, the more she realized that this was her true calling. She was helping people heal, empowering them to take charge of their own futures. As the workshop ended, one woman approached Margaret. She looked at her with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I never thought I could do this. But now, I see that I can." Margaret smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. But as she watched the last of the women leave, a sudden thought crept into her mind. James. Would he ever try to reach out again? Would his influence over her life ever truly fade? Margaret shook her head. No. This time, the future was hers to shape. And nothing, not even James, could take that away from her. The sun was setting as Margaret sat in her small office, a soft glow from the evening light filtering through the window. Her desk was cluttered with papers, notes from her latest financial workshop, client files, and receipts. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like the mess was manageable. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was the signs of a business growing, of her dreams finally taking shape. The reality of it all felt a little surreal, but there it was. She was doing it. The phone on her desk rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, ready for another question from a client or maybe a supplier. But when she heard the voice on the other end, a sense of quiet excitement washed over her. "Ms. Harris, this is Rebecca Turner from Wealth Forward Partners. I've been following your progress with your financial consultancy, and I must say, we're impressed with what you've built. I'd love to discuss the possibility of a partnership. We think your expertise could be a great addition to our team." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. A partnership? This was the kind of opportunity she had once only dreamed of. "I'm listening," Margaret said, her voice steady, but her mind racing. Rebecca outlined their vision for expanding into a new market, one focused on providing financial literacy services to underserved communities. They wanted to offer workshops, financial coaching, and long-term financial planning, and they needed someone with Margaret's specific background and approach to help lead the initiative. "We believe in what you're doing, Ms. Harris. You've built something meaningful, and we think we could help take it to the next level," Rebecca added. The excitement was palpable. This was what she'd worked for, what she had fought so hard to build. And here it was. The opportunity to not only grow her own business, but to make a real impact on a much larger scale. After a few more calls and meetings, the partnership was sealed. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had made it. From the depths of financial ruin to this, her own business, thriving, and now with new opportunities to reach more people. The first few weeks of the partnership flew by. Together with Rebecca and her team, Margaret began to design new workshops tailored to a broader audience. The clients kept coming, and so did the success stories. With each workshop, each success, Margaret's confidence grew. She was no longer just helping women in her local community. Her work was now reaching people across the country. With the increase in income, Margaret was finally able to pay off old debts that had once haunted her. The weight that had settled in her chest for years, always wondering if she would ever get out of the financial hole James had left her in, began to lift. She was no longer tethered to a past that threatened to drag her under. Instead, she was standing tall, with a future that stretched ahead of her in ways she had never imagined. At home, things were changing too. Emma was blossoming. Margaret had watched her daughter step into a new sense of confidence, mirroring the resilience Margaret had found within herself. Emma's career was taking off, and she was beginning to navigate her personal life with a newfound sense of balance and independence. Margaret had always been proud of her daughter, but now she felt something else: admiration. Emma, seeing her mother's transformation, had started taking more initiative in her own life. No longer consumed by the weight of James's manipulation, she was charting her own course, finding stability in her career, building healthy relationships, and even starting to think about her own future in ways she hadn't before. One evening, over dinner, Emma looked across the table at Margaret, a quiet smile on her face. "You've really done it, Mom. You're living your dream. I'm proud of you." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She had worked for so long to give Emma a sense of stability and safety, and now, seeing her daughter standing on her own, strong and confident, filled her with an overwhelming sense of peace. With the new business opportunities rolling in, Margaret began to think about how she could give back. She started attending conferences, speaking on panels about financial literacy, and even getting invited to lead seminars for women's empowerment. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. She was becoming known as an advocate for financial independence, someone who had turned her pain into purpose. And the best part? She wasn't doing it for anyone else. She was doing it for herself. Margaret booked her first international trip, a quiet getaway to a small coastal town she had always wanted to visit. She didn't need to explain the decision to anyone. She just wanted to experience freedom, to feel the wind in her hair and the sand between her toes. It was something she had put off for far too long, always prioritizing everyone else's needs before her own. Now, she was taking back those moments that were hers and hers alone. As she walked along the shoreline, the waves crashing softly against the rocks, Margaret let out a deep, contented breath. The past was behind her. The future was bright. But just as she was soaking in the moment, her phone buzzed in her bag. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was an email from Rebecca. The subject line read, "New partnership opportunity." Margaret's heart fluttered, but then something unexpected hit her. A brief but undeniable flash of unease. Would this opportunity change everything again? Would this lead to something bigger? Could she continue this pace? She took a deep breath and hit open. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And as the sun set over the horizon, Margaret smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning. The day began like any other, quiet and steady. Margaret had just finished a new set of client documents when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a potential partner or another opportunity. It was a name she hadn't seen in months. James. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the screen, her mind racing. It had been so long since she'd heard from him, and the last time had been a final, painful goodbye. She had rebuilt her life, her confidence, and now here he was, reaching out again. Margaret's stomach tightened, and for a moment, she wondered if the peace she'd fought so hard for could be taken from her so easily. She took a breath, steadying herself, and tapped the message open. "Mom, I've changed. I'm ready to make things right. I've been through a lot, and I realize now what I did to you. I'm sorry. I need to talk to you. I want to reconcile." The words felt like a punch to her gut. His apology, the same empty promises she'd heard too many times, echoed through her mind. Was this real? Or was it just another attempt to manipulate her back into his grasp? For a moment she hesitated. The faintest glimmer of doubt lingered in the corners of her heart. Was he really sorry? Or was this just another manipulation? But the woman she had become over the past months knew the truth without needing to question it anymore. She had faced enough of his lies to see through them now. The voice that used to beg for understanding was no longer hers to entertain. Margaret put the phone down, her pulse still thudding in her ears. She didn't need to second-guess herself anymore. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, she sat with David Lee, her lawyer, in the same small office where they had started their legal battle against James. There was a sense of calm in the room now, an energy that wasn't there before. The energy of someone who had reclaimed her life and wasn't about to let anyone, especially not James, take it away again. "I got a message from James," she said, her voice steady, though the words still felt heavy. "He says he's changed. He wants to reconcile. I need to know what I can do to make sure he can't manipulate me again." David nodded, his expression unreadable. He had always been the calm in the storm, and it was exactly what Margaret needed right now. "Well, legally speaking," David began, "he's still bound by the court's decision. You've made it clear that you want nothing to do with him, so you need to make sure he knows that." He tapped a pen against the desk, thinking for a moment. "We can file a restraining order, just to be sure. That would give you the legal protection to ensure he cannot come near you or your assets. You don't have to respond to his messages, and if he persists, you have every right to report it." Margaret felt a surge of relief. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to rebuild her life. The thought of James coming back, trying to chip away at her newfound peace, was something she simply couldn't entertain. "I don't want to go back to the way things were," she said, more to herself than to David. "I've worked too hard for this." David met her gaze, his expression softening. "You're right. You've built something for yourself, Margaret. Something no one, not even James, can take away from you." She left David's office feeling lighter, her decision clear. She wouldn't let him back in. She wouldn't allow him to keep tearing at the edges of her life. The years of doubt, of guilt, of wondering if she could fix him, those were over. That evening, as she sat at home, Emma called. Her voice was familiar, comforting. Margaret could tell her daughter had been thinking about the situation too. "Mom," Emma said carefully, "I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this. I know James might try to make you feel guilty again, but I'm here, and I'm proud of everything you've done." Margaret leaned back in her chair, a deep sigh escaping her lips. "I'm not going back to him, Emma. I can't. I've been down that road too many times. I have to focus on what's ahead, not what he wants." "I know, Mom. I just wanted to remind you that you don't have to do this alone. You've got me. You've always had me." The words settled into Margaret's heart like a balm. For so long she had felt like the weight of everything was hers to bear alone, but not anymore. She had the support of Emma, of Linda, and of her own strength. "I'll never let him hurt me again," Margaret said firmly. A few days later, Margaret filed the restraining order, putting the final legal barrier between herself and James. She couldn't control him, couldn't stop him from continuing with his lies or his manipulation, but she could control how much access he had to her life, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Margaret felt more like the woman she had become, less like the person she had been, a woman broken by betrayal and fear. She focused on her business, on her clients, on helping other women rebuild their lives, just as she had done with her own. The workshops continued to grow in success, and the confidence that had once felt foreign now filled her every step. She received an invitation to speak at a national seminar on financial independence, and when the day came, she stood on the stage, the spotlight warm on her face, as she shared her journey with an audience of women who had been through struggles similar to her own. "I've been where you are," Margaret said into the microphone, her voice steady, clear. "I've been manipulated, deceived, and betrayed. But I'm here today to tell you, you don't have to stay there. You can take control of your life. You can take control of your finances. You are not powerless." As the applause rang out, Margaret looked out into the sea of faces before her, women who were finding the strength she had found, women who were, like her, learning to trust themselves again. But as the applause died down, Margaret's phone buzzed once more. She glanced at the screen and saw a familiar name, James. Her heart skipped, but she didn't hesitate. She pressed the button, and as she read the message, a smile spread across her face. "I've changed. Let's try again. I need you." Margaret's grip tightened around the phone, her resolve unwavering. The past would never define her future again. With a calm breath, she deleted the message and for the first time, let go. She was done. And she was finally free. The morning light crept slowly into Margaret's office, casting long, soft shadows on the walls. The air was still, as though the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something. Margaret sat at her desk, her fingers lightly grazing the keys of her laptop, but her mind wasn't on the work in front of her. Today, she was making a choice. One final decision that would close a chapter in her life, once and for all. She stared at the screen, the message from James still open, lingering like a bad memory she hadn't quite been able to erase. His words were familiar, the same manipulative plea she had heard so many times before. "I've changed. I need you. Please, let's start over." For a moment, she felt the rush of everything, the hurt, the anger, the hope she'd once had for a better relationship with him. It was all there, just beneath the surface, clawing to get out. But Margaret didn't flinch. She knew who she was now, and she had seen that face, that lie, enough times to recognize it for what it was. Margaret's fingers moved, slowly but decisively, and clicked the block button on her phone. She felt the weight of the decision settle in her chest, like a heavy stone falling into place. It was done. There would be no more contact, no more emotional blackmail, no more empty promises. Her heart raced, but not with fear, with freedom. A deep breath. She opened her email. She wasn't finished. Not yet. Margaret pulled up the restraining order paperwork David had helped her prepare. It had been ready for days, but she hadn't been sure she could go through with it. But now, as she sat in the stillness of her office, she knew what needed to be done. Click by click, she filed the papers, setting the final legal barrier between herself and James. She wasn't just closing a door, she was locking it. She was securing everything she had worked so hard for, the life she was rebuilding, the people who depended on her, the future she had promised herself. The feeling wasn't just one of relief. It was a quiet, unwavering strength, a kind of peace she hadn't felt in years. The stress of James's manipulation had been the undercurrent of her existence for so long, and now, with the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place, she felt the last of the tension leave her body. For the first time, there was no threat, no lingering uncertainty. It was done. Margaret looked around her office, her space, her life. It was hers now, not anyone else's. Her clients, her business, the work she did to help others escape the same traps she'd fallen into. She smiled to herself, a soft but certain curve of her lips. This was who she was meant to be. Not a victim, not a woman shackled by the mistakes of the past. A leader, a teacher, a force. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find Emma standing there, a warm smile on her face. a glint of excitement in her eyes. Her daughter was different now, stronger, more independent. Margaret could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke of her career and her life. The transformation wasn't just hers to experience. Emma had been growing alongside her, and now they were both stepping into the future with a new sense of purpose. "Hey, Mom," Emma said as she stepped in, holding up a framed certificate. "I've got something for you." Margaret raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's this?" Emma grinned, her smile contagious. "You're officially the recipient of the Women's Empowerment Award. You were nominated for your work with financial literacy and for helping so many women reclaim their financial independence. The ceremony is next month, and I thought you'd want to know. They're really excited to honor you." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was the kind of recognition she had never imagined for herself. Not this grand, not this public. It felt surreal. A validation of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. "Emma, Margaret's voice faltered for a moment. She didn't know how to put it into words. "Thank you. For everything. For being here. For being strong. I couldn't have done this without you." Emma stepped forward, hugging her tightly. "You've done everything, Mom. You're amazing." Margaret held her daughter close, feeling the weight of everything she had endured and everything she had accomplished settle between them. In Emma's embrace, Margaret felt the final shift inside herself. She had done it. She had rebuilt her life, and she had done it not just for herself, but for Emma, for the women she helped, for the future. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, looking out the window at the stars. The world outside was still, peaceful, but her mind was alight with possibility. She wasn't just living anymore. She was thriving. The foundation she had started was beginning to take shape. Her consulting business was growing faster than she had imagined. And now this award, a symbol of all her hard work and dedication. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She glanced at the screen and saw a name she hadn't expected. David Lee, her lawyer. She picked up the phone, half expecting more legal talk. But his voice was light, almost warm. "Margaret, I wanted to personally congratulate you," David said, his voice carrying a smile. "You've done incredible things, and I think I can speak for all of us when I say we're all so proud of how far you've come. But there's one last thing." Margaret raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" David's voice turned more serious. "The restraining order you filed, it's final. You're completely protected now. James will never be able to touch your life again. You're free, Margaret. You're free." Margaret held the phone to her ear, the gravity of his words settling in. "You're free." The truth of that hit her like a wave. She hung up the phone, a soft sigh escaping her lips. And as she sat there, letting the full weight of her new life wash over her, she realized that it wasn't just about what she had built, but who she had become. Stronger, unbreakable, free, and the future was hers to shape. The next chapter was just beginning. The morning was crisp, a cool breeze brushing through the trees outside Margaret's office window. She sat back in her chair, looking around at the walls she'd covered with accolades, photographs, and framed certificates, each one a testament to a piece of her journey. But it wasn't the awards or the titles that held the most weight for her. It was the impact she had made, the women whose lives she had touched, the countless stories of financial recovery she had helped write. Her foundation, the one she had started just a few short years ago, was growing. What began as a small initiative had exploded into a nationwide movement, reaching women in underserved communities, providing them with the financial education and resources they needed to break free from the cycles of poverty and abuse. It was no longer just a passion project, it was a force. As she reviewed the numbers, the calls for partnerships, and the growing list of supporters, A sense of pride filled her. Margaret had built this from nothing, against all odds. The emails and phone calls thanking her for her work were constant now, but they didn't feel like noise. They felt like proof. Proof that all the late nights, the difficult decisions, the sacrifices, it had been worth it. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes glancing over the Foundation's website. The mission statement was clear: to empower women financially, to help them regain control of their lives, and to provide the tools necessary to succeed on their own terms. She had created this platform not only for herself, but for every woman who had felt small, powerless, or trapped by circumstances outside her control. Emma knocked and stepped inside, her presence filling the room with warmth. She had become such an integral part of the Foundation, helping to organize events, manage outreach, and bring fresh ideas to the table. She had grown into her own power, much like her mother, yet with a lightness that spoke to her own healing. "Mom," Emma said, holding up a letter, "you've got a letter from the local women's group in Pineville. They say you've made a huge impact." Margaret took the letter from Emma's hands, the words on the page unfolding like a promise she had kept long ago. As she read the heartfelt words from the group, detailing the change her work had brought to their community, she felt her chest tighten with emotion. "We've built something lasting here, haven't we?" Margaret said softly, her voice thick with gratitude. This, this is what I was meant to do. Not just for me, but for all the women who thought they had no choice." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "You gave them that choice, Mom. And you didn't just teach them about money. You showed them they have the strength to stand on their own." Margaret looked out the window again, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had never expected this kind of recognition, not this level of change, not this kind of impact. But here she was, a woman who had been broken, rebuilt, and had, in turn, helped others rebuild. This was her legacy. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly to herself, more to the universe than anyone in the room. A few days later, Margaret stood on a stage in front of hundreds of women, speaking at a national conference on financial independence. The spotlight illuminated her, casting her shadow long on the floor, but it was nothing compared to the shadow she had once lived under. She no longer felt small, no longer struggled with the doubts and fears that once paralyzed her. Today, she was a leader, a beacon for others. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady, confident. "I stand before you today as someone who has walked through the fire, someone who has felt the sting of betrayal and the weight of financial insecurity. But I also stand here as someone who has fought, not just for herself, but for all of you. We all have the right to be free from financial manipulation. We all have the right to reclaim our independence." The crowd erupted in applause, but it was the faces in the crowd, women who had been where she had been, that mattered most. They were listening, learning, and, with her help, finding their own strength. After the speech, Margaret stepped off stage, her heart racing. She'd been speaking for years now, but each time it felt as though she were living a new part of the story. She was no longer the woman who had been financially dependent, emotionally drained, and constantly manipulated. She was a force for change. Back in her office, Margaret received an email with the subject line, "Invitation to speak at Global Financial Empowerment Summit." She couldn't believe it. Another major opportunity, one that would take her advocacy and business to a global stage. But just as Margaret was about to respond, Emma called her into the kitchen. As she entered, she saw Emma holding a framed photo of the two of them, taken during one of their early workshops. Emma set it down with a smile, and Margaret could see the pride in her daughter's eyes. "Mom," Emma said, "I've been thinking. I want to work more closely with the Foundation. I want to help make it bigger, reach more women. I think we can really change lives." together. Margaret's heart swelled with emotion. She had always wanted to build something meaningful, but now, seeing Emma stand beside her, her equal in every way, felt like the greatest gift. Margaret had started this journey alone, but now, she wasn't alone. She had Emma, she had her foundation, and she had a future filled with potential. I'd love that, Emma. Together, we can make this last for generations, Margaret said, her voice full of promise. And just as Margaret was soaking in the moment, a notification popped up on her phone. It was another message from the Global Summit organizers, confirming her participation and the event details. Margaret paused for a moment, reading the invitation. She smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. Margaret's legacy wasn't just in the business she had built, or the clients she had helped. It was in the ripple effect of every woman she had empowered, every woman who would continue to pass it on. And as she looked at Emma, who was now fully by her side in every sense, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing she had built something that would outlast her, something that would keep on giving long after she was gone. Her legacy would live on, not just in her foundation, but in every woman who took control of her life, just as Margaret had. Margaret stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the ocean as the wind tousled her hair. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and for a moment she simply breathed. It had been a long road to this place, physically, mentally, emotionally, but here she was, standing at the threshold of everything she had worked for. The freedom she had once dreamed of now felt like her reality. The last few years had been filled with growth, with building, with constant momentum. But now, as she stood on this rocky outcrop overlooking the water, there was no more urgency. There was no more fear or stress about what would come next. She had built her business, her foundation, and her life. She had changed the narrative for herself, and now she was free to enjoy the fruits of that labor. She'd promised herself that one day, when she was free of the weight that had once held her down, she would travel, see the world, live in the moment, without looking over her shoulder. Margaret had long dreamed of standing here, on the edge of something vast and beautiful, a world full of possibility, not bound by fear, but defined by choice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a reminder that she still had responsibilities, still had a growing business. But for now, she let it ring. She wasn't going to let anything pull her away from this moment. She wasn't going to let anything take her peace. The past had a way of creeping back, but Margaret had learned to put it in its place. She had been manipulated, controlled, suffocated by the needs of others for so long. But here, in this moment, there was only Margaret, the woman she had become, the woman she had fought to be. And that woman was not afraid anymore. She spent the next few days exploring the coastal town, visiting places she had once only read about or dreamed of. The food, the people, the quiet pace of life, all of it was new, fresh, and full of promise. Margaret had never been one to indulge in luxuries, but she was beginning to allow herself to. This wasn't about reckless spending or living in excess. It was about enjoying the simple, beautiful things she had put off for so long. Back home, Emma was flourishing as well. Her career was taking off, and she had begun taking on more leadership roles within the foundation. She had found her own rhythm, much like Margaret had. They were no longer just mother and daughter. They were partners, each learning from the other, each growing stronger. Emma was thriving in a way that made Margaret both proud and relieved. The foundation was now truly something they had built together. One evening, as Margaret sat in her living room, sipping tea and reading through a new set of proposals for her next round of workshops, Emma walked in, her eyes bright. "I've been invited to speak at the National Women's Conference," Emma said, her voice full of excitement. They want me to talk about my experiences growing the foundation and how we've turned it into something that reaches so many people. Margaret's heart swelled with pride. I always knew you had it in you, she said, setting down the papers and pulling her daughter into a tight hug. You've come so far, Emma. I'm so proud of you. Emma pulled back slightly, a shy smile on her face. It's because you showed me how, Mom. You taught me to never back down, to fight for what I believe in. You gave me that strength. Margaret held her daughter's gaze for a long moment, feeling the weight of the words sink in. She had always believed in Emma, but now, seeing her daughter stand tall and strong, Margaret realized just how far they had both come. They were partners in this, each of them finding their own way to heal, to empower, to make a difference. With their business expanding and Emma taking on more responsibility, Margaret began focusing more on herself. She returned to the gym, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time reading and reflecting on her own growth. She hadn't had the chance to care for herself during all the years of struggle, but now there was room for it. She had built this life, piece by piece, and now it was time to nurture it. One weekend, Margaret flew to New York to attend a global financial summit. She was invited as a keynote speaker, but as she sat in the green room before her presentation, she couldn't help but think about how far she had come. The woman she had been, the one overwhelmed by debt, manipulated by her son, constantly second-guessing herself, felt like a distant memory. Standing backstage, preparing for her moment in front of hundreds of women, she felt a quiet calm wash over her. She had learned to trust herself. She had learned that she was enough, and she had built something that would last. Her reputation as a leader in financial empowerment was spreading, and she was invited to speak in places she never dreamed possible. As Margaret took the stage, the crowd welcomed her with warm applause. She shared her story, just as she had so many times before. But this time, the words felt different, more powerful, more real. I am not just a survivor, Margaret said into the microphone, her voice steady and confident. I am a woman who reclaimed her life. I fought for my freedom, for my dignity, and for my future. And I'm here today to tell you that you can too. The crowd erupted into applause, and Margaret felt the familiar surge of emotion. She wasn't just speaking to them, she was speaking for them. For all the women who had been taken advantage of, for all the women who thought they didn't have a voice, for all the women who had believed they couldn't change. She left the stage that day with a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of belonging. She wasn't just traveling to new places, meeting new people, or attending summits. She was part of something bigger. She was leaving a legacy built not on money, but on empowerment, resilience, and the strength of the women who followed her. That evening, Margaret sat in her hotel room, looking out at the skyline, the city's lights twinkling below. She knew she had created something that would last long after she was gone, a foundation, a community, and a movement. The future was full of possibility, and Margaret knew she was just getting started. For the first time, she felt like she had it all: freedom, peace, and the knowledge that no one could ever take away what she had built. She was free, and nothing, not even the past, could change that. The morning sun stretched lazily across Margaret's living room, bathing the space in a warm, golden glow. She sat on the couch, a cup of tea in hand, gazing out the window at the familiar view of the neighborhood. It was a simple scene, but to Margaret, it was everything. It was a life she had built, a life she could now enjoy without the weight of fear or regret shadowing every step. The house was peaceful, calm, the noise of the past finally gone. She had worked tirelessly to get here. From the moments of doubt and uncertainty, when she had wondered if things would ever change, to the long, exhausting days of fighting for justice. She had rebuilt her life, not just physically, but emotionally. She had transformed herself, from a woman drowning in manipulation and lies to someone who now stood firmly on her own 2 feet. The transformation had been slow, but now, looking back, she could see it clearly. She had reclaimed everything that was rightfully hers. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifted back to the beginning. The time before the trial, when she had been unsure if she would ever be able to trust again, when she thought that James's manipulation would break her. But she hadn't broken. Instead, she had fought back. She had taken her power back, piece by piece, until she was whole again. Her heart was no longer shackled by guilt or fear. She had let go of the person she used to be, the victim, and embraced the woman she was now, the empowered, independent, and unshakable Margaret Harris. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her reverie. It was a message from Emma. "I got an email from the Women's Leadership Conference. They want to feature you in their upcoming documentary. They're focusing on women who've overcome adversity and created change. They said you're an inspiration to so many. How amazing is that?" Margaret smiled, a proud warmth swelling in her chest. It seemed like just yesterday she had been unsure of whether she could even make a difference. But here she was, featured in a documentary, recognized as an advocate for financial independence and empowerment. This was her legacy, and it was just beginning to take shape. Emma had grown into a strong, confident woman, following her own path in life. They still had their moments of closeness, of course, shared meals, shared laughter. But Emma was an adult now, living her own life with strength, independence, and the same resilience her mother had shown. Their bond, rooted in love and respect, had only deepened over the years. They both knew that their journey was far from over, but they also knew they had each other to rely on. It was the kind of partnership Margaret had always dreamed of. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, gratitude for the life she now had, for Emma, for the foundation she had built, and for the women who came to her seeking help. They had all found something together, a sense of hope, of purpose, of community. It wasn't just about money, it was about reclaiming control, reclaiming their own lives. And Margaret was there, not just as a mentor, but as proof that change was possible. The foundation's reach continued to expand, and with each passing day, Margaret felt the weight of the past, the years of struggle, the manipulation, the heartache, lifting a little more. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving, and the best part was that she was doing it on her own terms. As she stood up from the couch, a sense of peace washed over her. The house felt like a sanctuary now, everything in its place, nothing out of order. The phone calls, the emails, the meetings, everything was manageable now. But more than that, everything was meaningful. She wasn't rushing through life anymore. She wasn't chasing something she couldn't reach. She was living it, every single day. That afternoon, she received a call that would cement the final piece of her legacy. It was the board of directors from the National Women's Financial Empowerment Initiative. They were so impressed by her work that they wanted to offer her a permanent seat on their advisory board. They were asking her to help shape policy, create programs, and provide insights into how to best support women across the nation. Margaret felt a rush of emotion. This was the kind of recognition she hadn't anticipated, but it was the kind that made all the years of sacrifice worth it. The call ended, but Margaret sat for a moment, taking it all in. This was more than just a business or a foundation. It was her life's work, her calling. And now she had the opportunity to change even more lives. But it wasn't just about her work. It was about her. Margaret had fought for her freedom, for her dignity. She had fought to reclaim everything that had been taken from her, And in doing so, she had created something that would live on long after she was gone. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her, by the abuse she had suffered, or by the guilt that had once crippled her. She had created peace in her life, and it was peace she would never give up. That evening, she sat with Emma, sharing a quiet dinner together. They talked about everything and nothing, the simple comfort of their presence filling the space between them. There was no bitterness, no past pain, just love, just mutual respect. Margaret watched Emma, her daughter now strong, independent, and thriving, and knew that her legacy would continue in her. It was a legacy of love, of empowerment, of knowing that no matter what life threw at them, they could always choose peace. Margaret raised her glass of wine, a smile on her face as she toasted to the future. "To us," she said, her voice steady and calm, "to the legacy we've built, and to the peace we've found." And as she leaned back in her chair, content, she knew, deep in her heart, that they had truly won. "They tried to take everything from me, but they never took my peace,"